Thank you very much, Pilar, for your very kind introduction, and to you and to the NUI Galway for the invitation. And it's a pleasure and an honor for me to present the sixth and the final webinar in this stimulating series. The title of my presentation, as you can see, and I just see faces in front of it at the moment, so I'll move you over to the side. The title of my presentation, as you can see, is Translating Children's Literature: What, For Whom, How and Why. But rather than starting with one of these questions, I'd like to share a double spread from a picture book with you. It's a double spread from a picture book about looking and sight by the husband and wife team of Romanishin and Leziv, leading contemporary illustrators from Ukraine. And on the left-hand side of the picture, you can see a fly, a very small fly on the bench, an owl, a girl, a dog, a horse and a cat sitting on a bench, and all looking at the same sunset. On the right, we can see an approximation of what each of these actually sees. The fly's vision is composed of innumerable dots. The owl sees sharply, but with fewer colors. The horse is missing a piece of the view in the center because its eyes are on the outside of its head, and so on. The world seen through 6 pairs of eyes appears quite different. The differences due to physical variations are perhaps more extreme than those between cultural perceptions, but I believe that the picture can nevertheless be taken as a metaphor for translation, because through translation, in the best possible case, readers get to see the world through different eyes from another perspective. So we move back to the question, why translate children's literature, which sounds a bit provocative. I was invited many moons ago to give a keynote at the IBI conference, the International Board on Books for Young People conference in London, which I gave the simple sounding but provocative heading to Why Translate Children's Literature. I've used this title before, and I'm sure everyone listening today or everyone attending the webinar today has their own answer to this particular question. And the question led to others, which I have since explored further in an attempt to map the complex field of translating children's literature. And I published an article with the basic map of actors, factors, and contexts, and I've added the bibliographical details to the final slide of the presentation in case anybody's interested in looking it up afterwards. So why translate children's literature? Let's parse the component parts. And this, at the same time, will reveal the structure of my presentation. If we parse the parts, we start with why, and this involves looking at the motivation and the interests of the various human and non-human actors. That includes publishing houses as well, organizations, translators, as well as the complex interplay of geopolitical, economic and cultural factors on publishing and literary transfer. Of the verb translate, we can ask for whom, translated for whom, and how is it translated? We're looking at questions of address and its role of in translation, and then to discuss determinants, strategies, and tendencies in translating children's literature. And finally, the object of translation, children's literature, we will ask the question, what is children's literature? Again, it's a fairly simple sounding question, but it's not actually as simple as it sounds. What children's literature is not, it's not a homogeneous body of texts characterized by features of content, style, or form shared by every book in the corpus. Its sole common denominator lies in its audience and in those who engage with it. Children's books are texts that are produced or deemed appropriate for children by adults. If we ask what children's literature is, what constitutes its corpus, we can establish that people don't always differentiate between the multifarious types and functions of children's literature that there are. We can see that there are different sources of children's literature. There are different addressees, or the range of addressees is very broad. There are different types of books. There are different genres and forms and different functions. I'll just say a brief word about each of these. The sources of children's books include folklore and fairy tales from the oral tradition. It includes books originally written for adults, like Robinson Crusoe, Don Quixote, which were adapted for young readers, and a more modern or recent phenomenon since the mid-19th century, material authored specifically for children. So as we can see, there are three very different sources which children's literature comes from. If we look at the addressees, who reads children's literature? You have pre-literate babies with their baby books and concept books, through to middle graders, to young adults, even adults reading crossover books, although they're maybe not necessarily the addressees. So you have a huge range of age groups who read what we know or what we call children's literature. If we look at the forms that the publications take, it includes picture books, pop-up books, any kind of novelty books, anthologies, novels, merchandising, tie-ins, novelizations of films or of series, multimedia texts. The genres, of course, include many more than I've written here. These are just as examples: adventure stories, drama, science fiction, poetry, and information books. I find it very interesting if I teach a seminar in children's literature and I ask my students to name 4 children's books or 5 children's books. I think 95% of the books that they name are either picture books or novels for children. They rarely mention poetry or drama, never information books, and never anthologies or even annuals. When you think magazines for children is part of children's literature as well. So there's a huge generic heterogeneity in children's literature, which people often don't consider when they're talking, and especially talking about translating for children, because to think of it as an umbrella term, translating children's literature, and if you just dig under the surface and you look and see what is actually involved, it's a huge range of matters are involved. Also, children's literature is characterized by varying degrees of complexity. The linguistic complexity ranges from, as you can see, the picture here of the ball with the single word ball on the picture in a concept book, through beginners reading to sophisticated adolescent novels. I have an example from Aidan Chambers here, which use all the various literary strategies that we know from postmodern literature in general. So again, the degrees of complexity are huge, which again has consequences for translation and talking about translation. We also have various different functions and artistry and notions of functions and artistry involved in children's literature. And it varies from texts which are purely defined by the degree of linguistic difficulty and their role in promoting literacy. You find beginners' books aren't setting out to be literary masterpieces, but they want to be good at what they do, which is the function of writing an easily understandable book. We have texts in which content is more important than form, especially information books. We have some material whose sole purpose is to amuse and entertain, joke books, for example, collections of jokes, to intellectually and aesthetically stimulating and challenging texts. So again, we have a wide spectrum of functions and claims to artistry, if you like. So all these things go to make up children's literature, and it's important to consider that or it's important to remember the heterogeneity of children's literature and the vast plurality of types and forms and functions when we're talking about children's literature. And when we look, for example, at what genres are translated, we find that poetry for children is rarely translated, whereas picture books, for instance, belong to the most translated children's books, as they are, I would say, wrongly thought of as requiring less in the way of translation and offer great greater opportunities for international cooperation. So just the simple question, what is children's literature, or the answer to the question, what is children's literature, should have major consequences for the way we think about how children's literature is translated, because of this breadth of material and functions and all the various other things that I've been mentioning. So with that, we move on to the next question, which is translate. Sorry, I have for whom and how appended to the verb translate. The questions for whom and how are, of course, inextricably interrelated. Both the imagined target reader and the idea of what is suited to their capabilities on the one hand, that's the who, but also the norms of the target culture and literature on the other, that partially determine how any given text is actually translated and which strategies are applied, is the how. These two elements are obviously linked. If we go to the whom, my answer to the question is, for whom is a book translated? It's translated for the implied reader of the translation. The implied reader of the translation is a term I work with, along with the implied or the implied translator and the narrator of the translation, all adapted from narratology to be able to describe the communication structure of the translated text more accurately. But at the moment, we're just looking at the implied reader of the translation. Differs from the implied reader of the source text and is constructed according to the answers that translators and publishers provide in any given time and in the given culture. The answers that the translators and the publishers provide to the questions: what do children want to read? What are their cognitive, emotional, and linguistic capabilities? How far can or how far should they be stretched? And what do they enjoy? But also, what is suitable for them? And these are thorny questions, if you like, because I'll move to the asymmetrical communication. Because children's literature, as I said before, is produced by adults for children, it's defined as literature where adults act on behalf of children at every turn. They write. The authors are adults, the translators are adults, the editors, the publishers, promotion, reviewing, selling, all these things are in adult hands. Recommendations, librarians who lend, teachers who teach children's literature, adults create, produce, and disseminate literature for children. This isn't, of course, a bad thing, because without adults, there would be no children's literature. So they are mediators and they enable children's literature. But what it also means is that adults are making decisions on the basis of what they imagine children are able to understand in the way that they configure the translations that they do for children. And part of the asymmetrical communication between adults and children involve the differences and the distances between adults and children in the areas of command of language. Obviously, children's command of language isn't as advanced as adults and has to be accommodated in children's books. Experience of the world, experience of literature. These are things which have to be taken into consideration, and they have differences that have to be bridged in children's literature. Which then adapts language, subject matter, formal, thematic features to correspond to the children's stage of development and what they can do, what they are interested in. When we say this, of course, we have there are no definitive lists of what children can do at a particular age, as every child is different. And when we say these literature has to be adapted to children's needs, the question is, is it being adapted to the needs the children really have, or are they the assumed needs that adults project onto children? And this is one of the conundrums, if you like, of translated children's literature, because a commonly related belief is that books are translated in order to enrich the target literature, the target children's literature, and to introduce children to foreign cultures. But very often it's exactly the foreign elements which are weakened or changed or expunged in translated texts, which are heavily adapted to their target culture or domesticated, allegedly on the grounds that young readers won't understand them. When translators and publishers strive to protect children from the unknown or from anything which they think will challenge them too much, we can speak of what I have called nanny translations. In other words, the translations are trying to look out for the children, that nothing will happen that might challenge them or push them too far. Or what children at any given stage in their development can actually understand and how much foreignness they can and do cope with is the ultimate black box of translating for children. And as Gillian Lathy, who I happily saw from the list, is actually here today, this evening, as Gillian Lathy has rightly pointed out, a greater emphasis on empirical research into reader response would inform current speculation. Translated children's literature is therefore the result of a balancing act by translators, understood in the broadest sense to include editors, publishers, etc., between adapting foreign elements to the child reader's level of comprehension and preserving the difference that constitute a translated foreign text's potential for enrichment of the target culture. With that, we move to the how. How do translators bring this about in their translations? The area of norms is one which has been heavily researched in children's literature translation studies, the influence of norms on how children's literature is translated. And these are the areas in which a lot of so-called manipulation of children's literature takes place. We know, and this is what Van Colley and Verschuren talk about, the difference between translating for children and translating for adults lies only in the degree, and I quote, to which it necessitates or allows a form of textual manipulation. Manipulation in children's literature can be morally, ideologically, or educationally motivated. The forces behind them can be, for instance, state censorship, as in the former German Democratic Republic, or in fascist Italy. And we have translation scholars who have documented these cases very thoroughly. It can also be self-censorship in the face of maybe political pressure. I think that's something which has increased in latter years in our own climes, self-censorship for authors and for translators as well. And the areas that are most frequently adapted or domesticated or changed in some way in terms of norms are linguistic, the areas of character and behavior, the area of physicality, and the area of content. Linguistic norms govern the use of language considered appropriate. For example, playful misspellings, as in Paddington Bear, were given in correct German in the first translation. Very often you find creative misspellings or misuse of language isn't always tolerated in translation. You have slang, you have informal registers, which are translated into more formal ones in translation, or dialect. Owen Harrington Fernandez spoke in an earlier webinar in this series about how identity and foreignness can be hugely compromised in this respect when he spoke about the English translation Manolito, Four Eyes. In the area of character and behavior, there's a famous historical example, is Pippi Longstocking, Astrid Lindgren, 1945. When the book appeared in other European countries in 1945, people were generally scandalized by this subversive, rebellious, and a girl as well. And many translations toned down this particular aspect. Pippi Longstocking is, of course, has supernatural strength. And in the Swedish original, she lifts up a horse, and for the French translation, they decided no, she couldn't possibly have done that. So Fifi Brandesier can only lift up a pony in the French translation. And Astrid Lindgren questioned this and wrote to the publisher, who replied, and he wrote, "It might be possible to persuade good little Swedish children that someone is capable of picking up a horse, but French children, who had just been through a world war, had too much common sense to swallow such a tall tale." In other words, he thought that French children would believe that a child could pick up a pony. Lindgren, in a very clever reaction, asked him whether he could send her a photograph of a French child holding a pony in the air. But as far as we know, the publisher actually didn't provide one. So these are changes in the area of characterization and context and characterization and conduct, which are deemed inappropriate in children's literature. In the area of physicality, we have a situation where it's, I think, fairly well known that in literature, children's literature of the USA, there seems to be a fairly strict policy with regard to not depicting nudity in any form, irrespective of whether children, adults, or even animals. In this particular example, you see a picture book from 1990 by Pia Lindenbaum. It's a story in which a Swedish girl has seven little daddies. And in the final picture, you see Elsa Marie and her mother as normal-sized humans in the bathtub with their seven little fathers, fathers, all naked in the bath. This picture was deleted completely from the American version. They didn't even try to change it. And as I said in relation to an earlier example, that's okay if it's only relating to the US edition. But when it affects co-productions, then it means that US notions of prudery are being actually exported into other countries if the books have to conform to these ideas. And an example of this can be seen in the picture book A Squash and a Squeeze by Julia Donaldson and Axel Scheffler, authors who I'm sure all of you know from The Gruffalo. And in this particular book, you can see on the cover of the book, you can see that the goat, of course, has an udder, as goats tend to do. But in a scene where the goat is sitting on a bed, Scheffler was told to remove the udder because they found they felt it looked obscene with the goat sitting on the bed with his udder, or her udder, visible. And so Scheffler had to actually amputate the udder. He later produced a graphic commentary on this case in the Die Zeit newspaper, where he shows his hand chasing his poor goat with the scissors, waiting to amputate the udder. As I said, it's okay if that's restricted to the American edition, but as it was an international co-production, it was repeated in every version that was produced in every country. So there was there were no udders visible in any of the editions. So I skipped that. I wanted to say something just briefly about strategies, which are what translators apply to go about manipulating the text in any way. We have omission and deletion. We just had an example of that with Elsa Marie, where a picture is just removed from the book to make it acceptable. Purification, in the sense that elements which are regarded as unsuitable are made suitable. A substitution, very often you'll have this in cases of domestication, which Zohar Shavit spoke about in one of the webinars in this series as well, where you have domestication where familiar elements will be substituted for unfamiliar ones, obviously names, rituals, whatever. Explication, where foreign elements will be explained in the text, or simplification in order to aid understanding. I have just one example that I'd like to show you of a substitution, although it's not a substitution based on the no, sorry, I won't follow that track. I'll show you the example and say something about it afterwards. The example is a Japanese picture book. And again, I'll mention the name of Gillian Lathy, who in an article reported how a Japanese student once surprised her classmates in a translation seminar by telling them that the English version of a Japanese picture book, which appeared to be a joyous account of a birthday party, was in the original quite a tragic little tale. And I followed this very interesting tip by Gillian and managed to get the Japanese version and the English version, and a colleague very kindly, a Japanese colleague, I'll tell you her name in a moment, very kindly translated the Japanese original, so we can actually see what was in the Japanese original and what the British translation did. Chihiro Iwasaki is the author, and the book was translated as Momoko's Birthday, although the protagonist actually has a different name in the Japanese original. The book, the protagonist is called Chi-chan in the original, who is about to turn 5, and in it she goes to a party and accidentally blows out her friend's birthday candles. And this is the critical scene. You see here the pictures are in color, and here is the scene. It's not a black and white copy. The incident has drained the color out of the scene for Chi-chan, who says in the translation by Tomoko Masaki from the Japanese, "Puff, oh, I blew out the candles by mistake." And then her little friends, like a Greek chorus, say, oh dear, Chi-chan has blown out the candles. She blew out her friend's candles. It's not your birthday today." The book goes on to describe Chi-chan's subsequent distress about the mishap. She runs away from the party before coming to the consoling end. Before coming to the end. In the text, I skipped over a text exactly. It's very dark now. Hanako has blown out her candles. I skipped over the English translation. I'm sorry. The Japanese version shows the distress of the girl and her Greek chorus friends who say, oh dear, and it's seen basically as a kind of a tragic event. The English translation, the translator isn't named. It says, it's very dark now. Hanako has blown out her candles. In the translation, the birthday girl has blown out her own candles. And then the very cheery, let's play blind man's buff, which obviously is telling a totally different story from the Japanese original, and a different story to go with these pictures. Why would a child look distressed after having blown out her own birthday candles? The story then goes on, and the protagonist says, the Japanese text here describes the girl's depressed feelings about her own birthday party the following day. Again, we have muted pictures, which shows her desolation. And she says, I don't like birthdays. I don't want anything. I don't want anyone to come to my house. This is what she says. And the English version, she happily wonders, I wonder what presents I'll get. I would love my doll to keep my dear Mayo, that's her dog, company. I would make clothes from them both. The translator here displays an astonishing lack of sensitivity towards the language of the pictures and the connection between the words and the images, and spoils the connection between the words and the images, which is the most exciting thing about translated picture books, is the way that they engage with the interplay between picture and text. And the more complex the task of the more intricate the interplay, the more complex the task of translation is. And it is the area in which some of the greatest transgressions take place within translation. So with that, we're moving back to the final question of the three: why translate children's? Then we also implicitly ask, why not? You're talking about the people who are involved, but you're also talking about the factors that inhibit or support translation. And if we ask generally about, or before we talk about these factors, it's not a bad idea to have a general idea of the situation with regard to translating literature, which countries translate and which countries don't translate or translate little, and which languages are translated most and which languages are translated least. This is something that one can talk about at great length. I'm going to try to restrict myself because I don't want to go off on a tangent, but maybe just to mention some important figures. The proportion of translations in children's literature varies greatly. It ranges from about 1% of the annual production of a given literature to around 80%. That's the range of percentages. The countries that give or export most are the ones that import or receive the least. Great Britain has approximately 3% of annual translation, and the USA approximately 1%. In the developed children's literatures, the Scandinavian countries top the list as those who are most welcoming to literature produced outside their linguistic areas, with Finland leading at around 80%. Figures for the Netherlands and Italy are around 40%, and Germany produces around 30% translations. It's important maybe to relativize this in the sense that if Britain only produces 3%, and this is something that the translator Daniel Hahn remarked at one stage, that 3% of a huge market is a lot more in terms of actual numbers of titles than, say, 30% of a market in a country which produces significantly fewer books. And I think that's it's a fair point to make, but it still is not a lot of attention being given to literature coming from the outside. So there are countries which mainly export children's books while only importing very few, and there are countries where there's the reverse situation. And they provide a market for the global corporations. 70 to 90% of books available to reading children in non-European American cultures are by European or American authors. That's 70 to 90% of books available to reading children in non-European or American cultures are by Europeans or Americans. But books from these cultures, non-European, non-American, rarely cross the linguistic, political, or cultural divide to partake in the Western market. There are organizations and publishers who actively address the situation, and I'll come to them in a moment. But I'd like to quote a colleague from Africa, Michael Daniel Ambachev, who wrote an article in the the Handbook of Research on Children's and Young Adults Adult Literature, 2010, and he wrote about the situation of children's literature in the developing countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. He talked about the weak publishing sectors, inadequate distribution mechanisms, poor purchasing power, all contribute to a severe shortage of quality Indigenous reading materials, making the acquisition of reading and sustaining of reading nigh impossible for all but the elite. And he goes on to ask about whether international publishers are more devoted to their profits and thus view Africa as a small expert market rather than a partner in the publishing arena, whom they should support and mentor and with whom they can collaborate. He's absolutely right, of course, and it's an idealistic position. And I don't think anybody in the large publishing conglomerates, who are now the 6th largest in the world, are actually media companies, where books are more or less a byproduct of what they do. And that's these are the hands in which the major publishing of children's literature on a large scale are involved. And Ambachev goes on to say, and I thought it was a very interesting figure, he said that on estimate, Africa imported 769 million US dollars worth of books from the EU alone between 1988 and 1991. And he said, add to these the millions of books donated by organizations such as Book Aid International, and one can see how difficult it is for African publishers, especially in smaller local languages, to become economically viable and produce a sustained supply of suitable storybooks. And it's important to note that these are countries which neither export their literature nor do they translate the incoming literature into their indigenous language. They're markets for the globalized publishing industry. The books are exported in English, they're not actually translated into the languages. So these are some of the factors which prevent other literatures being able to position themselves in the European market or in the European or the American or any other market, because of the very difficult conditions that they have in relation to producing their own literature and getting a foothold into the market. I just gave examples of factors which can also influence on a small scale when we say what is translated or what actually goes to be translated. We have cases where things like expiring copyright leads to retranslation. The Little Prince, famously, I think 1994 is when the copyright ran out, and 3 new translations immediately appeared as soon as no more royalties had to be paid for the translation. And I think it was a year or a fourth followed in 2000 on the centenary of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's birth. I was going to say something about Cornelia Funke, but I think a lot of you are familiar with the situation, just as another example of kind of individual factors that actually promote or bring about or facilitate translation, where Cornelia Funke, who is of course in the meantime a world famous name of children's literature, but that it took her a long time to actually get a foot in the English market. And it was because of a young German girl who lived in London and who wrote to a publisher and said, why can't I read my favorite author in English? And Barry Cunningham then actually read a translation in English, which Cornelia Funke had got her cousin to do for her. And that's how she actually got a foot in the English market. And we know what happened after that. So these are factors which are just interesting, I think, to notice in terms of how publication can be influenced. The final point is about actors and motivation. I'll try to cut this a little bit short because I'm running fairly long. If we look at the actors, what motivates the different actors, human and non-human, in the zone of translating children's literatures, and which publishing houses are actually active and try to pit themselves as Davids against the Goliaths of the globalized media conglomerations. We have a number of publishing houses which set out to publish literature which otherwise wouldn't appear on the market. I'll just mention as well that there are organizations, there are national funding agencies, there are non-profit organizations who are active. A major one, of course, is IBI, the International Board on Books for Young People, set up in 1953 to engage cultural bridge building work in the area of children's literature, and through their recommendations and their prizes, they want to make international children's literature more known. You have charities and non-profit organizations. I think well worth mentioning in Britain is the Book Trust, which set up in other words, project to help publishers find and acquire children's books and translations. So we see a very good activity there on a charitable level. Also outside in the world is a British organization dedicated to promoting and exploring world literature and children's books in translation, or the educational product Translation Nation, which sent translators into inner city primary schools to have children find out more about the work of translation and to make translations themselves of folktales from other cultures. So there are non-profit organizations and charities. There are national funding agencies who fund translations to get them better known, and prize awarding bodies. A word just about this one particular publishing house, which I would like to mention, Baobab. It's a Swiss. Where did I get fresh? It's a Swiss publishing house, which has been working for about 25 years. And they are dedicated to publishing books from Africa, Asia, South America, Oceania, and countries, and with a special focus on indigenous literatures and literatures which otherwise would have a hard time getting published in Europe or in any other country. Indeed, I was going to show an example of a book that they published, and I'll just show this here as a teaser, which, if there's by special request at the end, because the time is running out, I will return to if people want to see it. But to finish off, I'd like to come back to the question, why translate children's literature, and look at translators. And again, Gillian is probably blushing at the end of her Zoom, because she's been mentioned so often today, and rightly so. Gillian wrote this wonderful study about translators, which she called invisible storytellers, the translators of children's literature, because they very often are not mentioned. They're anonymous, or they don't receive much attention. She's called them the great disappeared of literary history. And she set out in this study to make translators less visible, casting light into the dark history of why translators translate, which is the question that I started my presentation with. Why translate children's literature? And Gillian identified a few different reasons for different translators, and I just like to mention three. One is obviously financial reward and status, which you can't blame them. Another is a motivation based on the texts themselves. In other words, the text might be similar to the books that they wrote. She was talking particularly about Wollstonecraft's translations, or to introduce imaginative stories into children's literature. Could be various motivations for translators to translate. And I'd like to finish with the words of an author, publisher, and translator, Siobhan Parkinson, who, as an answer to the question, why translate children's literature? And it's one of my favorite answers. It's tremendous fun and hugely worthwhile. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emer. Thanks so much.